So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the panel. Actually, the panel is going to introduce themselves, and we'll start at the very far end. Okay. Bruce.
All right. Thanks, Todd. Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah. All right. I'm Bruce Tunnicliffe. I'm president and founder of Vertex Environmental. We're a specialized environmental contracting company. And you may have also attended Smart Remediation. I founded and run that. And so if you haven't attended Smart, you should come out. I'm here today. So what do I know about excess soil? I, along with QM, helped to run the soil management area down at the waterfront Toronto, the Portlands, the redevelopment of the Don River. And in the last few years, we've treated over 100,000 meter cubed of soil, hopefully sustainably, and reused it right back on the property again. And so I have a practical experience when it comes to excess soil. I'm not an expert, a QP, I'm not a lawyer, and so my opinions are that of how I've interacted with the regulation and some of the roadblocks I've seen and some of the innovations I think that we could make. And so I thought I would start with a general comment to frame an idea. And then Todd said that we should be somewhat controversial. It's the last talk of the day. And I thought I would share a thought, a complaint, an observation that I have at the end, with Todd's permission, of course.
Permission granted.
All right. So the thought is here is I think and I hope that excess soil, one of the root of it is sustainability. And I think that we're at a watershed moment in our society with climate change. And I think that you can probably akin the changes that we're about to experience because of climate change to the start of the Industrial Revolution, maybe the computer revolution of the 2000s, how we live and work. And so I really think that excess soil, I hope, goes a long way with reduction of greenhouse gases, the view of soil as a resource, not a waste. And just to share this thought is there are only 6 cities in all of Canada that have a population of over 1 million people. I don't know if you knew that. But they are in order of population: Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, and Ottawa squeaks in just over 1 million. And so coming up in 2025, the same year, coincidentally, that excess soil regulation is going to prevent soil going into landfills, our immigration rate is going to open up to 500,000 a year. Canada has a positive birth rate, and so therefore the increase in our population is probably going to be maybe upwards of 600,000 every year. So every 2 years, we're going to add the equivalent of a 7th million person city to Canada. Where do immigrants go normally, or people that are new to Canada? They normally go to cities. So I say all this because I think it comes back to climate change and the use of excess soil. I think we need to become very efficient with how we use our soil, and I think innovation is really going to be part of that. And if we've got equivalent of 1 million person city coming into probably our existing cities every year, we're not going to be able to truck our soil really far away or bring soil back in. We're going to have to be really careful with how we use it and minimize the distance that travels. And I'm quite passionate about that, and I hope that happens. And so that's my thought. My complaint on that is that although if excess soil, if I view it in its infancy as something really good, and I hope helping climate change, and whether you believe in climate change or not is another thing, but I hope that you do, and I hope that we work towards minimizing it in the future as a society. I think that our other regulations are stuck in the past. And so me as an innovator and using new technology on sites, sometimes come to a site and say, we should do this, or we could use bioremediation there, or we could do something else over here, maybe soil washing. And the old regulations that are stuck in the idea of soil as a waste says, oh, you can't do that. What's your emission? I'll give you just an example. I can stop talking, but I wouldn't mind talking about it a little more later. So if you're on a site and you have wet soil, and it'd be pretty easy to use some mechanism to dry it, to filter press it, to reuse it on site. And the ministry says, not just the ministry, but I guess our rules, so I shouldn't blame the ministry. I blame the rules, the regulators. Maybe I blame the ministry. I don't. But is they say you cannot do that because you don't have an ECA. You don't have a valid ECA. If you want to get one, it's going to take you 2 years to get an on-site ECA. You have a mobile ECA, does it match it perfectly? Oh, it doesn't? Oh, I don't think you can use it. And then there's noise issues. So complaint of noise, it's like, okay, you got something you could use, a piece of equipment that might be able to dry out your soil, for example. They're like, nope, it could make noise, it might injure or violate, not injure, but violate someone's hearing a short distance away. Meanwhile, you got dump trucks driving everywhere, you got excavators driving everywhere, you've got noisy piece of machinery, but you can't do something to help with sustainability on the site. My complaint is that innovation is sometimes limited because of the regulation that's currently in place that does not properly intersect or work with excess soil. So that is my comment on that.
Cutting red tape. Over to you, Megan.
I'm Megan Janes. I'm a principal at Geosyntek and a part-time soil filmmaker. Thanks for listening to that 10-minute video earlier on. I had a lot of fun doing that and meeting many people across the country. So as a principal at Geosyntek, I'm involved quite a bit in excess soil and soil management. And I've had the joy of working in consulting for many years, but also working on the governmental side as well for several years. So I bring that perspective of consultant and that owner project leader to it. So I can see that the fiscal responsibility that owners need to bring. I can see that beneficial reuse approaches that have been used in the past. As Bruce had mentioned, sometimes the regulation interferes with that. I don't think that's the intent of the regulation. I think we have to find ways forward to still pragmatically reuse soil. Some of the hot topics that I see, I'm hoping we'll talk about, and I think have been talked about earlier today, is some of that soil reuse and beneficial reuse. I want to call it recycling soil. I don't want to call it beneficial reuse. I want to talk about recycling soil on-site and off-site and trying to encourage much more reuse within the project area, reusing it not just as soil, so valuing it as soil, but think about the aggregates that we're excavating from locations and being able to foster reuse of that, or even manufacturing aggregate if we're excavating soil. Or manufacturing building materials, thinking about those soil in another way. So reusing it on-site and off-site, recycling it. Want to also talk about leaving the soil in place, looking at environmental quality procedures to try to leave the soil in place, or find other ways to assess the soil so that it can be reused more easily. Project planning has been talked about earlier today, finding ways within your project area to reuse the soil, maybe really interesting topography changes in your plan. A lot of innovation can be put there. And then finally, financial incentives to do this. I've learned that the Netherlands offers bonuses to contractors who recycle soil and aggregate in their sites. Why aren't there some things like that we can use here? There's other jurisdictions that are doing really interesting pilot tests or demonstrations, offering grants. There's a lot here, I think, that we can encourage our industry to push forward and find that innovation in that soil space.
I'm Krista Barfoot. I'm the Vice President of the Canadian Brownfields Network, and I'm also a active member of the Ontario Environmental Industry Association. I'm part of the excess soil committees on both of those things, and I've also been a long-term member of the ministry's excess soil engagement group. And I've been a consultant for a couple of decades now, for sure, focusing on risk assessment. And so my engagement with the reg has largely been associated with site strategy. As much as I love digital technologies, and people like Kevin can go on and on about awesome digital technologies that will help us with excess soil, my focus has really been in how do we strategically develop a project to make excess soil management work, and especially work now under the regulation. And so it's looking at things like your contracting strategy, some of the things that have been talked about already today, as well as your construction schedule and your construction phasing and your site design. How do we design the site to allow as much as possible to be left in place at the site, as well as a setting of reuse standard. As a risk assessment person, I know that these standards we're all held to under the reg that are generic are incredibly conservative, and there is room for different standards to be used at different sites with the correct justification. And so how do we play within the regulatory framework to make it really work well and work cost effectively and promote beneficial reuse of soils of the site, decrease the trucking, and have more sustainable construction projects?
Manisha?
Hi, I'm Manisha Nandi. I am the Environmental Director and Director of Development Engineering at the Kilmer Group. The Kilmer Group is a private equity company developer focused mostly on developing brownfield properties. So the majority of my career I've been spending dealing with dirty dirt. But certainly over the last decade, I've been involved in discussing the excess soil regulations with the ministry through various industry groups, much like Krista, through CBN and ONEA and the Excess Soil Engagement Group and OHBA. I'm hoping to offer a bit of a different perspective today, more from a developer perspective. And I'm glad that Megan brought up recycling. I grew up in the era of the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle. And I only more recently in adulthood recognized that, they were done in an order. The first one was reduce. And I think we had a lot of discussion today about the reuse and recycle aspects of soil. But the thing I'd like to focus on today is more on the reduce side. As developers, we are in a position to design our sites in a way that reduces the amount of excess soil we produce. So I'm excited to talk to you about that a little bit today, as well as talking a little bit about some of the barriers that still exist to that good design that will allow us to implement really optimized soil management plans and reduce our excess soil footprint.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kevin Goldberg. You heard me earlier. I'm the president and co-founder of SoilFlow. SoilFlow is the most prominent soil tracking system in Ontario right now. I said earlier, we've tracked 7 million cubes since January, which is a big milestone for us, which is awesome for 2022. Still have to finish the year up. I approached the industry kind of as an outsider, learning from this group and many people around here, and I've probably spoken to most of this room, and if I haven't, I hope to speak with you going forward. My controversial, take here and everything is, when did it become so innovative to replace the paperwork you have on site and in your office, which is, what soil tracking is. So from my perspective, when I look at things like what Bruce and Vertex do and, what the other people on this panel have done with soils, I think calling digitization, a substantial innovation is a relatively low bar. I might be shooting myself in the foot by saying that. Having said that, it's what can you do with that information once you start to collect it. So our customers, our clients, the people we work with, once they start to understand the data that on how much soil they're moving, where it's going, what type is it, I think it was mentioned in the best management practices panel earlier, that's when the real innovation can start to kick in. That's when we can truly start to understand our numbers, our beneficial reuse, and begin to incrementally improve on those numbers for greenhouse gas emissions, for climate change, for sustainability reduction, etc. But right now, if I ask most people in this room how many loads they moved or how many cubes they actually moved and where they went in 2022, I imagine not many would actually know the true and accurate answer. So look forward to talking about that.
Okay, so we have a bunch of questions, obviously preordained, that we talked about before we came here today, but I want to make sure you all have an opportunity to ask questions. This is the final panel. This is an opportunity for us to say, what is new, what is innovative, what are you seeing that we should be looking at going forward in the next iteration of this symposium, or in fact, in the next iteration of any changes to the regulations. So don't be shy. If you have a question, you can start right now, or I will jump in. And I don't see any questions on the app yet, so here we go. I'm going to jump in with one already. So I like the soil recycling idea and reduce first. Are consultants more likely to say, no, you need to do all these plans instead of just leaving it in the ground? Is there and this is a bit controversial because I know there's a lot of consultants in the room, but is there easier ways to do it that don't involve like a whole bunch of engineering drawings? Like, what's your take on that?
Todd, everything involves a whole bunch of engineering drawings.
Leaving it in the ground involves engineering drawings?
Absolutely. I think Krista can probably speak to that around the risk assessment side of things. But certainly, to me, there's two things that drive. There's three things actually that drive removing soil from the ground. One is contamination, and risk assessment is a great tool to manage through that issue. Another is geotechnical. I've seen a few people in the crowd that represent this side of the industry, but the ground improvement industry is a really important way to improve the geotechnical conditions of the soils while enabling it to stay in place and support whatever it is you're trying to build on top of it. And then the third, of course, and all of those require a lot of drawings, Todd. And the third, of course, is design. One of the most meaningful changes I think that I've seen in the last little while from a policy perspective, more so than excess soil regulations, I'm sorry, Ministry, is the City of Toronto taking away the minimum parking requirement for developments in the city. And why that's important is because a lot of the excess soil driven by developments in Toronto is driven by the need for underground parking. We're a highly constrained city, highly constrained sites. Municipalities over many years have said they don't want to see above grade parking. It's not like Chicago, where you see consistently across the city, 5 stories of above grade parking with a high rise on top of it. That's not done in Toronto. It's not generally accepted in Toronto. So that was forcing a lot of that parking to go underground and causing a lot of excess soil coming out of developments in the city. And this change only just recently happened, I would say within the last year. So we're really just starting to see how it's being implemented within the development industry, but a huge, huge potential for developers to now reconsider how much parking they really need to put into their developments, and continue to advocate with the city around, if we do need to put parking in our developments, how much of it can we push above grade? Because do we really need to be producing all this excess soil and finding a place for it to go?
So I'm educated as a geotechnical engineer, but practicing as an environmental engineer. So I really think a lot about that intersection of geotechnical engineering and environmental engineering. And when you talk about recycling soil, I know that geotech plays a huge part in it. But I see in other parts of the world where, like Florida, they're reusing crushed shells for granular aggregate for roads. There's innovations out there that we could apply here, and it does take some of those reporting, it does take some of those site demonstrations, it does take the municipalities and maybe OPSS updating their specifications so there can be more reuse. And I know there are some municipalities that are in Ontario that are doing some of those things to encourage more recycling of the material. But there's so much more we could do than just that simple, dig it out, put it back in. If there's geotechnical needs, we could augment the soil. If there's no immediate needs on the site, I've seen a lot of new innovative companies coming forward with developing soil building materials. So they're excavating out the material and they're making bricks, they're making armor stone out of the soil with different polymers. So there's a lot of innovative tools, and we need to bring that here. We need to start doing demonstrations and pilot studies to show that these are possibilities here to recycle the soil.
And I just add to that to Manisha's point, there's a lot of reasons soils move, and if you want to be strategic and select about which soils those are, it does mean you have to do some testing, and maybe you start that testing in the absence of engineered drawings if you don't really know site development, but ultimately you want all of that to mesh together. You want your understanding of the design of the site to go with the work you're doing on the site so you can make good decisions about where to put things to minimize the amount of soil you have to move. So if you have an area of contamination, needs to be removed anyway, maybe that is a good place to put your basement. So you really want all of those pieces to mesh together to really be strategic and cost effective about how you handle soils at the site.
Bruce, Kevin, you want to add to that?
Yeah, just going to add a comment. I think you need engineering, and I think you need controls. And you mentioned something earlier, the planning up front. And I think you absolutely need planning up front. So the more you can plan, I think the better that you can incorporate things. And I just wanted to share a thought that I had, because you mentioned risk assessment too and how it's useful. And I think it's very useful. But in terms of regulation, maybe not working for us as much, and I'll share a thought, is the concept of an RA, I think, is you do a phase 1, so you know everything that could be happening. You do a phase 2, so you have your maximum concentration. And then you have an RA where your property specific standards is about 20% above your maximum. And that's, I think, the generally risk assessed approach. But anyone that gets involved in redevelopment may know that you have surprises along the way. I've worked on sites where you find a tank no one knew was there, it's filled with oil. So the maximum concentration isn't what you found in the soil, but something more. And I think the problem with some of the approaches is that there's not a flexibility in some of the plans. So you make an engineering drawing and the end result has to be the engineering drawing, or the end result maybe has to be the property specific standard that you set. When you encounter something on site there's not an ability to be flexible and adapt. And so what I would rather see is if the maximum concentration that a risk assessment would allow could not be the max you find plus 20%, but maybe close to a maximum allowable, then I think you could reuse a lot more soil on site. So I think you can try to move engineering and regulation and on-site practicality somehow together a little bit better to make a more, and I'll go back to the sustainable approach that I think we need as part of it all.
I think that's what I was alluding to, is the on-site practicability. So Kevin, you want to?
Yeah, from what I've seen, it basically always just comes down to money. And I think that, in my opening speech, I mentioned how we'll now truly know what lies beneath our feet. And I think for a lot of developers, not all developers, people would just always default to the minimum testing. The minimum testing would say, okay, this soil is contaminated and it's contaminated everywhere. Now we have more stringent testing, and we're going to have a more accurate idea of what's really beneath us and be able to do those more sophisticated delineations to beneficially reuse that soil on site. Without any information, we find people usually default to the easiest solution, which they think is the most cost effective, but in reality, there could be a more cost effective solution.
Yes, of course.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Something that was just been mentioned, I want to elaborate on that a little bit about due diligence. And because Bruce, you mentioned some aspects of reusing soil within the project area, and it was mentioned on a panel earlier. I think Janet and Matt had mentioned due diligence. We as practitioners approach due diligence in different ways. We don't have a standard framework for due diligence, and I think one of the innovations we can bring is setting some benchmarks for due diligence so that we're all approaching it the same way. So when there's those sites that aren't strictly following all of the different sampling frequencies and such, there's due diligence approaches, or there's due diligence approaches for reusing soil within its own project area. So I think that's something that we all need to work on in the industry.
Okay, I'm going to dive into some sort of a segue to that, which is there a disconnect among contractors, or is everyone generally using the same reporting and engineering systems? And I think, Megan, you mentioned some of the incentives that came out of Netherlands. So are there other ways that people can make this happen, and from a reporting and engineering process?
I'll make a quick comment from a contractor's perspective. I think that a lot of the plans are set before a project begins in a lot of ways, and that goes to the pre-planning. And then the QP have a lot of, I think, say over what occurs on a site. And I've talked to a lot of different contractors about what they do, and there's some contractors that just simply don't really know about the regulation. And so you asked, what are contractors doing? And I would say contractors may not be the ones that care or do a lot. Some do, but I think a lot don't. And I think the regulation might be pushed from the government to engineers down, as opposed to a grassroots, let's do this and come up. So my comment is, I don't think contractors do a lot. I think contractors try to work within a rules-based framework and try to optimize to get lowest cost in that rules-based framework. And I think there's a lot of confusion right now, I would say, around the rules.
From contractors?
From a contractor's perspective, yeah. Not even quite knowing what to do, what's acceptable and what's not.
Okay.
I think I'll go to bat for my contractors a little bit here. I think what the contractors really want to see is a level playing field, and knowing that if and when they're doing the right thing, the people they're bidding against are doing the right thing as well. Okay, good. I knew there were contractors in here. There you go. And beyond that, it then becomes, okay, all their excavators are running, for the most part, the same diesel, the labor's the same. Almost everything is the same when they go to do a bid. So where's their edge? And I think that the ones who are trying to be smart and sophisticated and grow their business are trying to leverage innovative approaches to do so. And that's what they're relying on. And that's how they plan on getting more work. But without a level playing field, and when they go in bidding and knowing they lost it to someone who isn't going to go to a permitted fill site and isn't going to retain the QP and didn't do all the samples that they were prescribed to and are just going to get away with it, you know, for them, it's like, okay, why did I just spend all this time doing this bid and following the rules of the owner, the general contractor, when the owner or general contractor might not be enforcing it? So, you know, there is a ton of top-down approaches from the sophisticated developers, the proactive developers, and then from the contractor's perspective, you know, yeah, they're confused. They had a regulation, they got ready for it, they invested a lot of money, like I said earlier in the day, and then, you know, oh, let's just kick the can down the road, regulation next year. So, you know, they continue to follow those best management practices throughout 2022. I think they realized the benefit of it, and now I think they have a really good idea of what they're going to do in 2023.
Any more comments on the contractor side?
I think you're bang on, Kevin. I do think as project leaders, we have an obligation to put together clear contract language that really sets the stage for all of the contractors bidding on our work, to recognize that they need to follow certain the regulation, obviously, but that the specific aspects of the regulation that are going to be expected, and it is beholden on our project leaders and our project leaders teams to enforce their contract language as well, because you're right, if we don't, we're really not setting the right stage. I do think, you know, over the last year, during this pause, we have seen in practice an improved understanding of what is expected and what is required from a testing and tracking perspective. And a lot of contractors are in good shape to start the new year. All of the changes and the pauses and the new exemptions don't help that situation. And I still do find myself shocked, even today, even, you know, as recently as last week, that there are still soils that are attempting to move in this province with no testing and with no reports. It is shocking to me that that's still happening, but it is happening. And the pause and the proposed exemption really just give additional credence to the people who are continuing to operate in that way. And it makes it really challenging for the rest of us to implement things the way they need to be implemented.
In terms of consistency in reporting, I will say, though, that I do think we are quickly getting to a place where the standard reports are becoming quite consistent in terms of assessment of past uses and sampling analysis plans and soil characterization, and partly because, to Peter's point, these aren't really new. As much as the language and what we call them might be new, and some of the specific criteria on how we do it might be new, this is a process that's been around for a really, really long time and is largely built off the Brownfields Reg, which has been around since 2004. So I think we're very quickly getting to a place where that is quite consistent and that is fairly standard through the industry. I think there are places where there is some inconsistency in treatment approach and still some confusion, and it's come up, but I think treatment of swim pond sediment and tunneling spills, I think there's areas where we still need to figure things out, but I think in terms of standard reporting, I think quickly as an industry, we're getting fairly consistent with that.
Megan?
Yeah, you'd asked about incentive for contractors, and so I've been thinking a little bit about that, just as you'd asked. Thinking about specifications, and I know many municipalities here have really put a lot of emphasis in the last couple of years of getting their guidance and their training, in-house training and specifications to incorporate all the excess oil regulations. So I feel like those tools are there. But what can the industry do to incentivize contractors for bringing forward more innovation in recycling material on site or bringing recycled material on site, and how can we help support that? I'm not a contract language person here, so I think that's for the municipalities. Maybe they can think about how they can they do that. But I think there's a world of change we can do. I think back to a project Krista and I worked on probably 15 years ago, where we were designing a soil bank for a region, and they were planning to use that as an interim storage site for one of their Lakefield properties. So they had a lot of infrastructure projects upcoming, and it didn't timeline work with the Lakefield site. So we had a soil bank in the middle. They didn't proceed because the contractor bidding on the infrastructure project had a cheaper solution to finding a home for the reused soil. But if you add in the GHG and all the so greenhouse gases and all of the dump truck traffic. So all of that impact on the community, it might have been better just to use the soil bank, but they didn't have a way in the contract tools to evaluate that bid. So we need to find ways to evaluate some of those reuse so the contractors can bring those ideas and they can be evaluated in a fair play.
Full cost accounting, asset management. We're going to stay on the contractor theme because there's a question online. How can the industry better engage with specialty contractors during the project planning and excess soil strategy stage of the project to take advantage of the latest innovations and practical experience? We kind of touched on that a little bit. Maybe Bruce, over to you on some of the innovations.
Yeah, sure, I can comment. I think that early engagement, and I've already said it a few times, we all have, but it's so important. Because if you're trying to, if you want a site-specific permit, well, one thing is allow any innovation to occur on any site at any time, but that just won't happen because the ministry wants to know that the processes are good and there's not undue emissions. But if you plan far enough ahead and you want to include that within your plan, then I think you have to. So it all comes down to forward thinking, and I'll credit. Waterfront Toronto and their planning there were to allocate an entire area of a project to be a soil management area with the intent of treating soil on site. And so you only have to truck it from pretty much where you can see to where you treat it to then truck it back to where you can see again. And how many truckloads of driving through the busy Toronto streets that saved? I mean, I don't know, but a lot. And if you just let it out to the contractor in general and said, what do you think? Then they'll think whatever they normally think. And so I think it needs to be two-part. One is upfront planning to maybe allocate areas of your site where you can do some form of treatment or management or something that you can do something innovative you don't know. And if you know what you want to do that's innovative, then if you need a permit or something up front to plan for it, some testing up front to show that it works, even if it's event scale, pilot scale testing, also what was done at the waterfront, then I think that's really useful and helpful for a successful project in the end. It's hard to at the last minute say, let's be innovative and not have a guideline around it.
Not every developer wants to have a whole pilot scale testing facility on their site, though.
The onus is also on the innovator, for better or for worse. So, if you are a specialty contractor with an innovation, if you're an innovation supplier, you have to do the business development legwork to get in front of the owners in the municipalities for them to ultimately accept or change their spec. Because everything is based off of that, and until you show them, it's pretty much at your word, and why are they going to trust you over the next guy? So a big part of it is getting in front of the right people, showing them the benefits and proving the benefits of what, Bruce, I'm sure you have to do many, many times. And I think Waterfront Toronto, unfortunately, is the exception, not the rule, in terms of let's go and find innovations out there. And most people are going about their day waiting for people to sell them innovation.
I think Waterfront Toronto was also in a unique position of having 3 levels of government involved and knowing what rules could be bent to work for that project. But I think that same concept can be used on any development site, and sort of taking an upfront view of your plans and thinking about what constraints are currently in your way of developing, the most innovative, sustainable development plan, and then trying to see which ones of those rules can be bent through maybe long-term advocacy with the regulator, maybe policy changes, or maybe there are just some different interpretations that can be made. So I think taking that same strategy of not assuming that constraints are constraints and actually really taking a deep dive into them is always a good strategy for innovation on any project. And the other one I wanted to bring forward is, we often try and build project teams that leverage many different disciplines of expertise. So, and particularly when we're trying to sort of optimize a below grade strategy, it's not only environmental or geotechnical. We need structural, we need hydro-G, we need a number of different people all in the room together and being given the mandate to think outside the box and to work together to find an optimal solution. No one can design in a silo. That will inevitably result in the wrong answer.
And I'll just kind of echo what Manisha said, because I think that one of our failures often in projects and as an industry is the constructor is the last person on the scene. And so that's when constructability gets considered. And that's, you're right, it's kind of late to be thinking innovatively at that point. And so you do want a constructor on your team early. You do want to be thinking about that and building your team accordingly. So you have that voice, you have someone who, and I agree with you, Kevin, like to some extent it is on the people to be selling their services, to be letting us know what's new. It's on us as an industry to be watching for that innovation, for looking for those new solutions and bringing those to clients. But a constructor is someone who also is part of that and is looking and listening for different things and has a different way of evaluating. So I think having that person earlier on your team and considering constructability far earlier in the process would be a great advantage to most projects.
Speaking as a former Waterfront Toronto employee, I like to think of the approaches there were pragmatic, maybe not bending rules, but very pragmatic approaches and collaborating with many of and all of the stakeholders to come up with those solutions. But I want to say that there was a great fortune to work on a project like that where innovators were coming to us and presenting their ideas and their approaches, things that have worked elsewhere in the world. And as Krista said, if we can, it's up to us to listen for that and to share that information and you spread the news. And try to pilot it, like find funding, find different tools to actually pilot it so that other people can hear about it. And I think there was someone earlier today who talked about case studies as well, of trying to promote case studies and sharing that information, because there's a wealth of knowledge here. And we need to all work together and bring this forward.
I think Connie just put up her hand. She's going to publish some case studies on environmentjournal.ca.
Hey, Todd,
Go ahead, Bruce.
I just want to share a comment on this about trying to work together and do it. We had a couple of attempts at things and we got denied. I think ultimately, and I'll share the couple of stories, is one on a certain subway line in Toronto. They were looking at doing vac trucks and a lot of vac trucks every day in order to clear certain areas. And we said, what if you made a treatment system right here that overnight it could settle out and then it would minimize the volume and it would be much more efficient. And the contractor was even thinking about buying their own vac trucks to do all this. We approached the ministry, said, can we do it? Because it's a long line, there's a property off to the side, it's all the same project area. And they said, we don't think a road's a project area. Can you prove it's not contaminated? Well, it might be contaminated. Then you need to do this, then you need to do that. And it got in a whole mess of what ifs. And it wasn't done. And so we tried to put forward innovation on the line and it was shot down because the status quo was easier to do than innovation. And that really made me upset because I think it would have been a much more efficient, better greenhouse gas, less costly solution, and we kind of got shut down. And the other was we do some water treatment for condo towers and the city just came out and said no more discharge, no more pumping system. And we said, oh, well, what about using some of the pumping system, but for gray water through the building? And that they also said no to that too. So I think we've had some good ideas that we've brought forward, 2 different areas, and both no. Why? Because it's different, and not everyone will do that different. And so innovators have a problem trying to put that forward. And so I think the bendy rules part is something that really helps. If you have power and say, well, no, let's try this, and then you say yes. And so. And I just share those 2 ideas that we had both shot down.
Is Sanjay still in the room? Is he taking notes still?
Don't give up, Bruce. Sometimes it takes 10 times advocating for the same solution with the same people before it catches.
Yes. Yeah, just banging your head against the wall sometimes.
And I just want to say, I don't like calling it bending the rules. I like calling it playing in the gray space of the regulation. It's not quite defined. If we can play in there, sometimes we find good solutions too.
Absolutely. But sometimes the regulations do need to be adjusted to support more innovative solutions.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to add to that? Okay. I'm going to go back to this sort of how do you get innovations happening. I heard today there's lots of exemptions There's testing exemptions. There's already existing exemptions. Some people are grandfathered. Can you speak to all these exemptions as part of the regs and how that probably dissuades innovators?
So a lot of the exemptions are geared to lower risk soil situations and are not necessarily totally inappropriate. I think, and people have talked about this today, sometimes it falls apart because the reg might say one thing, but a reuse site might insist on something else, or a municipality might insist on something else. So the exemptions, and I mean, there's a lot. So I'm trying to think specifically about what some of them are, but they are generally geared to actually trying to be more practical and trying to be less intense on situations that shouldn't require the same level of intensity. Like if it's not a contaminated site, if it's not a site where we should believe there is a problem, why would we do as much testing there as at a contaminated site? Like that does practically make sense. And it actually kind of aligns with the best management practices guideline that came out in 2014. It was essentially a risk-based approach to deciding how much sampling was needed. So I don't think that the exemptions are necessarily misplaced. I think in the practicality of working under a regulation and people having fears around liability, that's where the exemptions become a little bit problematic. And at the end of the day, wherever you're trying to take your soil is going to be the place that dictates what you're going to have to do. So the exemptions may or may not really be functional under the regulation. I think that's the bigger concern.
Okay. Anybody else want to talk about?
Yeah, there's a couple that are really interesting, and I know we're all working on these. The topsoil exemption, and the infrastructure exemption, and those are ones to really dig in and explore more, and that's where that recycling of material can really take off. Topsoil is fascinating. Grant mentioned it earlier that there's more sites that are capturing that topsoil, but I've also heard of sites that are very selectively moving the topsoil so that they can capture the microbes in the wealth in that soil. It's almost like soil on high octane, and so this topsoil is great value. But bringing that same lens to looking at infrastructure, excess soil, and bringing it to an infrastructure site. So those exemptions, I know we all know about them. It's just applying them and pushing that forward. I don't consider it innovation, but I think maybe the innovation is that we've done some of those things in the past. We need to bring it into the space under the excess soil regulations and make it still work.
I agree with you, Megan, especially in the topsoil exemption. There's a lot of opportunity there, and it just reminded me of one of the barriers I wanted to bring forward, which is we have provincial regulation that speaks to how soil can move, but the province isn't the only sort of regulator that determines how soil can be used. So for example, within municipalities, often there are specifications put forth for what imported topsoil can look like. And if you look at, I'm not going to name names, but two relatively local municipalities, they have either recently or are in the midst of putting forth topsoil specs that are effectively unachievable outside of a fully manufactured topsoil facility. That really reduces a lot of opportunities for good topsoil reuse with minimal trucking for local reuse sites. So it's another area that I want the ministry to think about in terms of how things actually get implemented, and maybe how it can influence some other stakeholders who also end up causing different reuse strategies within projects.
Everyone's pretty quiet.
Yeah, I think we're hearing that some of those specifications really drive a lot of the innovation. So the more innovative we can be in those specifications, I think will help. Okay. So topsoil, or it's as I talked about some of the aggregates, finding some ways to reuse the material in the specifications. And I know municipalities, some are doing that. There's some really innovative tools out there in Ontario. So let's try to get those spread to other groups.
I think my issue with exemptions is that everyone always just defaults to doing absolutely nothing.
Right.
It doesn't mean you don't maybe want to try a best management practice, understand what you're moving, maybe track it to get your own metrics and so forth. And then there seems to be little incentive on the flip side. I mean, Monisha, you spoke about lower tier government, but when you go and look at places like the United Kingdom, for example, an illegally dumped load of soil carries a fine, one of His Majesty's landfill tax of £10,000 per truckload, and then an additional Environmental Protection Act fine of another £10,000 per truckload because it's considered illegal waste dumping. So, I mean, if any of you run the numbers for yourself of 20,000 Canadian dollars on a per load of soil that you maybe had go to the wrong place because it maybe didn't fall into that exemption. Meanwhile, also in the UK and other places, basically everywhere else around the world, you have to know your greenhouse gas emissions when you're moving. You have to know how much carbon. And right now, it's only that to measure the baseline. They understand we need to know where we're at right now so we can make a measurable impact on the future. So I think there's a lot of gaps when it comes to exemptions, and at risk of sounding like the guy who wants more regulation, just, everyone's defaulting to the do nothing status quo. So in absence of that, higher level regulation on those bigger picture items, I don't really see how we're going to get there.
More enforcement.
Yes.
I'm going to go back to the questions online. Have you seen use of the BRAT tool in action, and is it contributing to innovative solutions and promoting soil reuse? Ditto with statistical sampling. Reuse sites do not appear to be embracing these tools.
We have some clients who have used the BRAT tool, I think, with some pretty good success, and I think it costs some money in consulting fees, but ultimately they can take higher levels of contamination, and they're doing it for specific projects. So I have seen it done. And then also those reuse sites who are now faced with people saying their properties are exempt from sampling are also sending their own people out to do their own sampling on those properties in order to make sure that they are in fact importing clean soil from this exempt property, which still isn't always clean, even though it's exempt.
I guess the quick answer is yes. We've used the BRAT tool for a couple of projects that looking at tunnel spoils and finding the reuse site and matching the tunnel spoils to the reuse site. So BRAT tool to open that up and allow the reuse sites to accept some of the tunnel spoils. So that was really a pragmatic approach forward to find a solution for tunnel spoils. But I think people talked earlier about some of the naturally occurring compounds in tunnel spoils, which are very problematic when you're trying to match it up with the reuse site. The other question was on statistical analysis.
Yeah.
Well, Bruce had mentioned the Toronto Portlands project, which embeds in some of the soil management planning the statistical approaches to evaluating soil. So yeah, those tools are available, and we should all be looking at them and using them. They're definitely very helpful for finding the reuse and reusing soil.
Yeah, I was going to comment. I haven't used the BRAT tool, but we were talking at lunch, and so I'll give a kudos to the table there for a conversation, which I'll share. A question perhaps I have is I think risk assessment is a great way to deal with risk and allow us to leave more soil in place. But I think there's a separation between what a risk assessment will allow and what the BRAT tool will allow. And I think that gray area is going to be a problem, because if you need to then do a full risk assessment to deal with especially like volatiles, VOCs, or petroleum hydrocarbon, it's going to be really tricky. And so my table had a question about how that would work, and I didn't have an answer, but I thought I would put it out to the general here about that I think there needs to be some better integration, back to my first comment at the start, better integration between the excess soil regulation and other regulations, that if you're allowed to do something within a risk-based framework and the BRAT tool won't allow it, so if you do an RA, it's allowed, you do the BRAT tool, it's not allowed to leave the soil there, how do you make that work? And I haven't seen that, but I just put that forward as a comment that I hope that we can get better at that as an industry to make it easier and faster to apply that risk-based criteria to leave soil on site.
I'm just going to add a little bit to that on the site-specific risk assessment. So for reuse sites, in addition to the BRAT, I've also worked on site-specific risk assessments to modify the reuse criteria for the site. what I think the challenge is we need an instrument. So our regulation says we need a legal instrument to do that, and I don't know if the industry, those giving instruments are quite ready. So is it the municipalities and their site alteration bylaws, or is it the conservation authorities through their own permitting process? I don't know if they're ready to give a permit for site-specific risk assessment on reuse sites. So that may be something that we all need to work on. BRAT tool is different. You don't need that legal instrument, but a site-specific risk assessment you do.
And I'll just add, so the BRAT tool is for setting standards for the reuse site. So it's okay if you are the reuse site and you are willing to adjust your standards, and maybe it doesn't even allow you to add RMMs to your site if you were willing to do that. But if you're the source site, playing with the BRAT tool may not actually help you, because you'd have to find a reuse site that's actually on board and is willing to go off the generic standards and use those. So you got to keep that in mind. That, I mean, it's great if you're the reuse site and you're looking to have less stringency in the material you can accept to your site. It is a great tool. If you're a source site, it's only going to be helpful to if you have a reuse site that's willing to play with it. So it's something to keep in mind. I will also note too, I have seen sites where they played with the subsurface soil standards. So I want to say it's table 5 off the top of my head. So there is a table that is for subsurface soils, for soils that are deeper than 1.5, far less stringent standards. So in cases where you have filling at depth, that's another option which doesn't require use of the BRAT or anything else. You do have to document it, obviously, but I have seen sites use that as well.
Just
Okay.
speaking to the readiness of regulators to issue instruments, we have a number of risk assessed sites around the GTA. And interestingly enough, all of the certificates of properties, which are a site-specific instrument for those sites, were issued over the last 2 years. They were all issued with a restriction on importing any soil that exceeds Table 3 site condition standards. So regardless of the fact that we have a full site-specific risk assessment, the regulator in this particular case was not ready to be issuing a site-specific instrument that would allow import of soil higher than the generic standards. So we're not quite there.
Yeah, so something to think about in doing risk assessments, build in the BRAT tool so that you can have site-specific risk criteria for imported soil.
How do we take advantage of on-site treatment and reuse on linear infrastructure projects where there simply isn't enough space within the project area to do so? And before I put it to the panel, the client in question is doing some linear infrastructure and they're digging pits, but that soil is going back in the pits when they're finished. But they don't have anywhere to put it. So they would like to move it to their yard, but they're not allowed to do that. So over to you. How do we manage excess soils on linear infrastructure projects when there's not enough space?
Well, I'll take a stab at answering it. So Vertex, ahead of the Portland's project, applied for and got a mobile treatment ECA that allows soil from anywhere within, let me back up. Before, if you were going to treat soil on site, you had to stay within the legal entity of the property, which seems like an archaic, ridiculous thought. And so to break that thought, the idea of project area was introduced, and if soil came from within the project area, you could treat it within the project area. And so at the Portlands, at the waterfront, it worked. I'm just wondering, and what we were trying to do with the hydrovac treatment, and it didn't work, but if you had a long line with some off properties that were all part of the same project site, if you could plan ahead, set that up, put your mobile ECA on there for treatment and then move it back again, I think that's a solution off the top of my head.
So I have seen some clients do essentially that, because the project area isn't defined by ownership. It's defined by how you define your project area. So I have seen clients that enter in agreements that have neighboring properties as part now of the project area, so they can essentially use that space. And sometimes it's just for construction staging, but it does give you more flexibility for room for things like treatment.
I think there's also the option of the local waste transfer facilities. So infrastructure project taking some of the road subgrade material or excavation material over to a local waste transfer facility and then reusing it in other projects as road subbase. So I think we've got some tools there to look at.
Kevin, I mean, this probably doesn't benefit you because if you're not moving it off site, there's no need to track it.
Well, you don't need to track it, but you can track it. So we actually have we have a number of temporary soil storage workflows and facilities on soil flow, of which I don't think any of them are in Ontario. They're in Connecticut, the UK, and Australia. And the key figure there is the fact that they don't have the same restrictions on these workflows, right? So they didn't need any fancy permits or any exemptions or anything like that. They had the ability, one's a utility company, to open 5 facilities throughout Connecticut to take in, their soils, stockpile them, test them, and put them on as backfill. Now, it's different, I think, than the question that's being spoken about there, because that doesn't really involve any treatment. It's more testing, stockpiling, segregating, and then resending out. But it does require a lot of organization from a soil tracking perspective to make sure that you know what's contaminated and you make sure that's not going back out on site and so forth. So I hope we see it in Ontario, and I hope it's not restricted by regulation. I hope, again, like I said at the beginning, we're kind of just in the first implementation phase, and Sanjay said it when he was up there, like there's still amendments, we're still learning, there's still changes. So we just need to collect this data and iterate in order to, be successful here.
Okay, I'm going to start wrapping things up. Is there any other burning question that we have for this innovation panel? Any final closing remarks, words of wisdom for everybody on how to go forth and innovate?
I just want to encourage everybody to find some ways to incentivize, contractors, your projects, find some tools within your organizations for grants and, offering those incentives, take some of those ideas from the brownfield space where there's municipal grants for doing some of those early studies, see if, can that work for excess soil and finding ways to beneficially use or recycle soil. So let's, maybe, I hate the word, think outside the box and some of those ways to incentivize the industry. Thanks.
Yeah, I was going to say I would like to see in the future relaxing of some regulation, and I like your Connecticut thought that you brought up. Because in the old days, I remember if you were digging contaminated soil out of the ground and there was a thought in the industry, if you broke the plane of the ground and put it above ground, then it was classified as a waste and you only had 90 days before you had to get rid of it, couldn't put it back in the hole. Like that whole thought, I think, is the problem. That same thinking process permeates our thoughts. And so if Connecticut, if you can take soil, put it there and then put it back, but with proper tracking, why can't we do that in Ontario? And it seems to me a bit ridiculous that we're still on this old ideology of soil as a waste instead of soil as a resource. And I think that we should try to break that thought within our regulation and break down barriers between regulation to allow a bit more smoothness of thought. Because time is money at construction sites, and if you have any delay, then boom, to a landfill or to the easiest spot it'll go.
And I'm just going to continue to beat the drum of whole project planning. I think that you always want to be thinking through your management of soils and other materials that are going to be generated through construction as early as possible and weaving it in through the entire project delivery. Like, don't wait until it's going out to the contractor to start thinking about how you might manage excess soil. So you really want to be building that into the entire project and thinking of the project as a whole and not as these discrete pieces.
I'm just going to close with something maybe a little bit controversial. Someone asked Sanjay earlier on the panel about sort of the linkage between More Homes Built Faster Act and excess soil. And I'd like to make a bit of a tenuous linkage. A lot of design around development is dictated through municipal comments that we receive through planning applications. What the province has done, rightly or wrongly, that's for a lot of different opinions, through that More Homes Built Faster Act, is to exercise its influence on municipalities and decisions that are made by municipalities around developments. There are, I can give a few examples. We have examples of comments that we've received through site plan applications, as an example, that say, we don't even want to see 1 foot of your below grade parking garage above grade. We don't want to see it. It's aesthetically unpleasing. It doesn't matter if you put a bush in front of it. The entirety of your underground parking garage must be below the grade of the site. That is ridiculous. I think probably most people in this room can agree that that is ridiculous. And yet, we have an entire industry of designers that are currently designing with that being a base expectation, knowing that that is something they are required to do in order to get through their municipal planning approvals. One of the things that happened in the new act was to remove municipalities' ability to comment on certain aesthetic aspects of a site plan. In my view, in this particular case, it's a great opportunity now for us to rethink how we design those sites that have historically been constrained by that type of a comment. So I do think there's a bit of a linkage. I do think that there's a lot of opportunities that municipalities have to change the way they look at developments, to change the specifications they put upon developments, to improve developers' ability to reduce the amount of excess soil that we produce, and that's absolutely consistent with the ministry's expectations and desire with their excess soil regulations. So I think there's still some opportunity there.
Take us home, Kevin.
Not much to add to any of that. I think, like I said at the beginning, I think we're doing great. I think we've really made a lot of progress, whether it's in tendering specs, innovations, getting this regulation through the finish line, knock on wood. I look forward to 2023 and, kind of seeing what this industry has for us.
Big round of applause for our panel.